Hi, everybody. Today's Friday, September 19th, 2025. And our friend, Ambassador Chas Freeman, is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Ambassador, let's talk. Let's start with snapback sanctions on Iran. Macron came out before the voting. He said that it would they made their mind about the snapback sanctions and they're getting along. They want to put more sanctions on Iran. They want to get back. And it seems that JCPOA in the process of dying and just passing away. I don't know what is the outcome of what is happening right now between the Europeans specifically, because these sanctions are all about Europe. It's not about the United States, because the United States has decided to withdraw during the Donald Trump's first presidency.
Quite
Go
right.
ahead. What's your take on that?
Well, I think this has to do with two things, neither of which has really got much to do with Iran. One is that the Europeans have come out, rhetorically at least, fairly toughly against Israel. And they are compensating in their own politics by being tough on Iran. That's one thing. This is managing domestic political cross currents. The second thing, very important, I think, and maybe the driving factor, is that they are trying to appease Donald Trump. They do not want to break with Donald Trump. They are hoping that they can reverse Donald Trump's disinterest in their war in Ukraine. As I've said before, President Trump has quite cleverly, I think, passed the buck to the Europeans on the war in Ukraine, positioning the United States to make money from arms sales to Europeans, which they will then transfer to Ukraine. This won't do any good for Ukraine, frankly. But Mr. Trump likes to fatten the coffers of his corporate backers, and the military industrial complex is very happy with this. So I think the Europeans are playing to Mr. Trump here. And I don't see that Iran apparently made an offer to reprocess down the 60% enriched uranium. But Europeans are driven by other factors, not that. So that's my interpretation of it. I may be wrong. I mean, I think it's frankly very foolish. You asked the question, where does this leave us? I think it leaves Iran with diminishing options, less options beyond going nuclear itself, developing a nuclear weapon. So it's an unfortunate development in any sense. And I know, that it comes in the middle of another very important development, which I haven't seen much discussed, which is the conclusion between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia of a defense agreement, which contains Article 5 NATO-style language, that an attack on one would be an attack on another. This is a partnership which has been discussed for many years. I believe, in fact, that the Saudis financed Pakistan's development of a nuclear weapon on the understanding that it would be available to them when and if they needed it. And I know that there have been reports of sorts to Israeli intelligence over the years that say that there are, in fact, warheads that have been manufactured by Pakistan for Saudi use that are kept in Pakistan, but which could be delivered on short notice to Saudi Arabia. In any event, what appears to be happening at a minimum is some sort of extended deterrence from Pakistan covering Saudi Arabia against Israeli nuclear attack. And of course, after the Israeli violations of sovereignty of Qatar and other countries, and their statements that they're prepared to do that again as they see fit, The requirement for deterring Israel is now a very live one in the minds of all the Arabs. And I'll just conclude on this by saying that as the Europeans propose to increase pressure on Iran, other things are happening in the region. Egypt has now violated the restrictions on the number of troops that it can maintain in Sinai. It's got 40,000 troops there. It also has air defenses that were prohibited. It has moved troops to the Philadelphia corridor border with Gaza. And I think in Doha, General Sisi, President Sisi, gave a very hard-hitting warning to Israel that, as he put it, not only are new agreements threatened, but existing agreements are being aborted. Very strong language with regard to Camp David, the Abraham Accords, and other things. So if this is a great moment to put pressure on Iran, I don't see the logic.
Yeah. Ambassador, here is what's going on in Iran is somehow interesting, how things have been interpreted in the domestic policy. They're talking basically those people who were not happy with JCPOA. They're talking this way. They mentioned two paths lie ahead for the Islamic Republic. One, the first option would be withdrawal from NPT and conducting a nuclear test. And the second would be restoring to somehow extending Resolution 2231, which means JCPOA, by offering even more concessions. He says that they believe that the first one would guarantee the nation's security and the second one guarantees war for Iran.
Yeah, I think that logic has been there for a long time. And of course, there is the example of North Korea, which did exactly that. That is, exercise the first option, withdraw from the NPT and conduct nuclear tests underground, of course, so there's no fallout. Iran seems to be quite good at tunneling. So that's a real possibility. And in fact, this is my objection to the Western US-driven policies toward Iran all along has been that basically they leave Iran with very little choice but to develop a nuclear deterrent against attack. And that is even more the case now that the United States has actually bombed Iran. There's one thing for Israel to have done that. Israel, of course, has a nuclear arsenal, and you can't, the idea that you can somehow ignore that and have no proliferation of nuclear weapons in West Asia has always struck me as fallacious reasoning. So I think we're seeing the Saudis now come closer to fielding a nuclear weapon. They may very well allow Pakistan to put nuclear missiles in Saudi Arabia, much as the United States put them in Germany and elsewhere in Europe during the Cold War. There's lots of precedent for this, and it doesn't violate the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Saudis would still be in a position to say, well, we don't have a nuclear weapon, but we do have the protection of an ally with a nuclear weapon. In any event, I think this makes what Europeans have done, the discussion in Iran, which is a logical outcome of maximum pressure policy, and the developments in Saudi Arabia, which may well be followed by others joining this new alliance, perhaps the UAE, perhaps Qatar, perhaps others. I think this all makes life a great deal less safe for Israel. If that's the objective of the Europeans, I think they've just misjudged. Let me just say a few final words about the Pakistan-Saudi partnership. Pakistan is a poor country that has nuclear weapons and that has a lot of Chinese weapons, which have worked very well in its battles with India recently. So Saudi Arabia is a country with very little military industry. and a lot of money, very rich. So this is a natural partnership. It's always been there as a possibility. And one of the consequences of it will be, because part of the objective is to build joint military production capabilities to reduce dependence on outside suppliers, specifically the United States. I think one of the implications is that this is building a bridge to greater involvement of Chinese technology in the defense of Saudi Arabia. And any facilities that are developed between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are very likely to embody Chinese investment in technology. So from the point of view of the United States, which for one reason or another, and I don't share the logic behind this, has decided that China must be blocked everywhere, this basically is very good for China and not good for the United States. So the attack on Qatar, to the extent the United States was colluded with Israel in that, it has it has sharply diminished the security of both Israel and the United States. And we haven't heard yet from Turkey, which, of course, saw the meeting of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation in Doha as a big opportunity to assert its own leadership in the Islamic world. And I think as others move closer to crossing the nuclear threshold, we're going to see the Turks react too. This is unsettling what is happening.
Donald Trump is talking about getting back to Afghanistan, the background base in Afghanistan, to take care of China, Ambassador. It's not, if they go there, it's not just about China, it's going to be Iran, Pakistan, and they want to. Do you think that would happen? That what is he trying to say? That even let's assume he has that in his mind. What is he? Why is he talking about it?
Well, he's put forward a number of really quite wild strategic ideas. Annexing Greenland from an American ally, Denmark, taking back the Panama Canal from Panama, despite treaties and other agreements. And I think this is in that mold. That is to say, it's a wild idea. The strategic logic of it is obvious. Bagram is a very central location, strategic, as you indicated, outreach to many places in southern Central Asia. But there's a small problem, and that is that Afghanistan is controlled by the Taliban. I suggest that there may actually be, on the theory that where there's smoke, there's probably fire, there may be some kind of under-the-table discussion going on between the United States and the Taliban that, if you let us back into Bagram, we'll do all kinds of wonderful things for you. But the wonderful things we might do, we're now incapable of doing since we abolished the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I don't think, much as Bagram may be important in the eyes of President Trump, I doubt that the Congress would be very enthusiastic about subsidizing the Taliban for various reasons, not the least of which is that despite Donald Trump's assault on wokeness, feminism is alive and well in the United States, and it's pretty dead in Afghanistan.
It's not. How do you see Russia and China? Because Russia has recognized the Taliban, the government in Afghanistan. And how do you see the policy of China in Afghanistan? Are they going to be worried about what Donald Trump has just said? I think it was
Of course, they'll be concerned, but I don't think they'll take it very seriously as a realistic proposition. in part because they do have a good relationship with the Taliban. And, they're very pragmatic. But I know that it was the Soviet intrusion into Afghanistan in, now I'm forgetting the date, but 1979, that energized the US-China entente against the Soviet Union. So both the United States and China had very active programs of assistance to the forerunners of the Taliban, many jihadi groups in Afghanistan, Mujahideen. And in fact, when I was the chief operating officer for the American Embassy in Beijing, we had $600 million annually from Saudi Arabia to buy Chinese weapons for the Mujahideen. The Chinese had their own program of assistance, but they were quite happy to oppose this intrusion onto their western frontier. They have a border with Afghanistan. It's a very small one, linked through a small corridor in the mountains, which is almost impassable. The Tajikistan and Saudi and China jointly patrol that area, and it goes into the Panjshir in Afghanistan. They will react to this, of course, but I think, as I said, that the chances of it actually happening are rather poor.
Yeah, Donald Trump was asked in his visit to the United Kingdom. He was asked if he would do something with the case of Israel, because as we talked about it before, the reporter asked him, how do you feel about what's going on in Gaza? Because many people believe that you are the only person and your country is the only country that could put an end to the conflict in Gaza. And he came out and said that it's all about the October 7th. You don't know the reality, and all of this. How because he said the same sort of rhetoric that we are hearing from the Israeli government is somehow, how do you see the relationship between Donald Trump and the Israeli government? Recently, in the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we've learned that Donald Trump is somehow afraid of Netanyahu. What is that all about? Do you think any sort of reality is
Yeah,
in?
no, I think he is. I hate to use the word, but he's essentially a puppet of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli right wing, the zealots in Israel. What is he afraid of? There are two possibilities. One is, of course, losing funding, because his major funding for his not only his presidential campaign, but a lot of his projects, his construction projects and business, has come from Zionist plutocrats who could easily withdraw their support financially from him. And he cares a lot about money, obviously. So that's one possibility. That is the more innocent possibility. The other is that Mossad and Israeli intelligence has some dirt on him. And that is very likely because of his connection with the Epstein. The Epstein issue obviously scares him a great deal, because the chances are that he engaged in improper behavior, and there is a possibility that this will be proven beyond a reasonable doubt by testimony of some of the women that were abused by Epstein and his clientele. And it is widely believed that Epstein had a very close relationship with Mossad and was, in fact, a Mossad case officer. So what's he afraid of? A combination of lost support and scandal.
Yeah. Here is part of what he said about the October 7th message.
Remember October 7th, one of the worst, most violent days in the history of the world, not just there, in the history of the world. And I got to see the tapes, and I wish I didn't see them, actually, but I got to see them. And I want an end. I want the hostages released, and I think it's going to be okay. But it has been a brutal period of time. But this has been going on for a long time. This is not something that's over the last year, 2 years, but this has been for decades and decades.
Yeah.
Right. Well, he does seem to understand that October 7th was part of a continuity going back to 1947, 48. Actually, it goes back farther than that. What he doesn't understand is that the brutality has been mainly emanating from Israel, not from Palestinians. If you leave the Palestinians alone, they do very little to endanger the Israelis. If you oppress people, and we have multiple studies of this, multiple examples, what tends to create terrorism is occupation. The occupation of a foreign country or foreign people, in this case, the Palestinians, by what is essentially a European colonial settler group, started all this. And who showed him the videos and who made the videos? I think it's very clear it was the Israelis. So he's a prisoner of the Israelis, and he's a hostage himself. It would be nice if he were released by the Israelis, and maybe then we could have some sort of action that would actually bring the Israelis to halt the genocide that they're conducting, and the seizure of additional land and the eviction of people from the West Bank. He doesn't understand this issue except from the Israeli perspective. And his ambassador in Israel, of course, is an evangelical Zionist who's completely swallowed the Israeli line. He doesn't represent any thinking from the United States. He's entirely in tune with the Israeli right wing.
I think, Ambassador, you're somehow familiar with the mindset of these leaders in the Arab states more than every one of us that are talking to our audience, me. And what is going on when they look at what has happened in Doha? And do they really fear what would happen in the future to them? And because when you look at the behavior of Saudi Arabia going, as you've mentioned, to have some sort of alliance, military alliance with Pakistan, we had the head of national security of Iran going to Saudi Arabia, talking with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and in terms of expanding the economic ties between the two countries, which would bring the security parts as well. How do you see the mindset in Saudi Arabia and UAE, maybe Bahrain?
Well, first of all, I think that what happened in Doha, the Israeli attack, will accelerate the rapprochement between the Gulf Arabs and Iran. And I think President Pezeshkian is absolutely correct to say that they share a common interest in opposing Israeli hegemony and defending themselves against Israeli attacks. And that is, as I said, the Saudi deal with Pakistan has been under discussion for quite a number of years. But I think it would not have happened without what just happened in Doha. Now, what is the mentality? First of all, these rulers in the Gulf are autocrats. They are able to repress the opposition of their populaces to their policies toward Israel and other places. They have a lot of freedom of maneuver. That's particularly true in the UAE, where the vast majority of people are not even Arab. They are immigrants, expatriates working in the UAE. But in Saudi Arabia, there's no doubt that common people are viscerally against Israel. and fearful of it. And so now the Arab leaders in the Gulf have a problem. The only country in the world that can project power to the Persian Gulf to protect them is the United States. But the United States is now basically controlled by Israel. So what do? They don't have much freedom for maneuver. On the one hand, they have a populace, their own people, who don't endorse their friendship with Israel, who are very dubious about the United States, given American behavior. On the other hand, they face serious dangers. Now, what have they learned from the attack on Qatar? First of all, they've learned the hard way that it doesn't help to engage with Israel. You can do everything you want to ingratiate yourself with the Israelis and make them feel at home, and you still get attacked. The second thing they've learned is that the United States will not protect them from Israel. Not only that, the United States doesn't have the capacity to get Israel to do anything positive. So this is a reminder that the so-called peace process, which was the longest running diplomatic fraud in history, was a fraud, that the United States, while posing as a mediator, in fact, was on the side of Israel. So they have been put in a very difficult position. The traditional backer of their independence, which is the United States, basically no longer backs them, no longer protects them. There's no alternative to that. Now, that is why you will see probably, as I suggested earlier, others joining this Saudi-Pakistani alliance system, because they've been left with no alternative but self-reliance. They've got to reduce their dependence on the United States, and they can do that, of course, to some extent by importing systems from Russia or China. And in fact, in the Sinai, Egyptians apparently have deployed the Chinese air defense system that's the equivalent of the S-400 in Russia. They're wrestling with a difficult dilemma. How do they protect their national dignity, their independence, their sovereignty, when their principal backer is on the wrong side in terms of protecting their sovereignty and independence? The logic of all this drives them, as I suggested, to try to make common cause with Iran to the extent they can. There's always been a possibility, if there were imaginative statecraft, to do in the Persian Gulf, in West Asia, what Europeans did during the Cold War. That is, hold a conference on security and cooperation on the basis of Islamic principles that are common to all of the countries in the region, whether they're Shiite or Sunni in their religious orientation. So I think this is a very pregnant moment, but we can't tell what is going to be born. But something will be born, and it will definitely reduce the influence of the United States. It will probably increase the influence of China, but there too, the Gulf Arabs and Iran have a problem. The Chinese absolutely do not want to get involved in other people's quarrels. And they don't want to take sides between Iran and the Gulf Arabs or between Israel and everybody, although they have come out most recently with a number of strong statements disapproving of Israeli actions. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu has just criticized them for criticizing Israel. But for most of the world looks at anyone who doesn't criticize Israel as some kind of fool or fellow traveler of Zionism. So this is the typical Israeli we're, if anybody criticizes us, it's because they're anti-Semitic. Nonsense. Um, the best example of that, Nima, is our ambassador in Jerusalem, Mr. Huckabee, and his fellow evangelical Zionists. Their theory is that if the Jewish temple can be rebuilt where Al-Aqsa is, and if various other things, including the sacrifice of a red heifer, female calf, cow, can be done, that this will bring on the end of days. All the Jews will be exterminated or forcibly converted to Christianity, and the Christians will be lifted up to heaven in eternal glory. This is anti-Semitic. It's pro-Zionist, but it's profoundly anti-Semitic. And it illustrates the fact that Zionism has left the religious principles of Judaism behind it. So, Islam and Judaism have a good deal in common in terms of ethical principles. And of course, the Holy Quran constantly cites the children of Israel to make points about the prophecies and the instructions that God has given people. But those principles have been set aside by Israel. And so you see now the phenomenon abroad of Jews saying, hey, wait a moment, Zionism has got nothing in common with Judaism. It's preserved some of the rituals of Judaism, but it's basically the equivalent of Daesh, of the Islamic State. The relationship between that extremist form of murderous faith and Islam is pretty tenuous. And the relationship between classical Judaism and Zionism is now pretty tenuous. So Israel is basically isolating itself, not just from the world, but from Jews outside Israel. And I don't see how that ends well for Israel. So I'm sorry, I wandered off your topic a bit.
No, I did. Yeah, it's excellent points, Ambassador, that you've mentioned. Because today I asked my audience, how do you feel about Israel today, comparing to what it was before October 7th? It's totally different. It's totally. You look at Israel in the eyes of Chinese, then Chinese coming out and talking this way.
Well, this is really extraordinary because traditionally, Japanese, Chinese Koreans have admired the Jews for their business acumen, for their intelligence, for their role in education, for their courage. That's all changed, and so that is a profound change, and it's all brought on by Israeli behavior. And sadly, the United States, because we have identified ourselves so thoroughly with Israel, has fallen into the abyss with Israel. So there are plenty of polls to indicate this trend. And it's taking hold even in the United States. Israel is losing American backing because of its behavior. And as, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who stands up and says, it basically speaks bald-faced lies. There's no starvation in Gaza. We're not killing anybody there. It's all Hamas. Charlie Kirk wasn't killed by Mossad, he says, because there's a conspiracy theory that he was, which I don't believe. But anyway, in fact, as I've suggested elsewhere, the fact that Netanyahu denies that Mossad killed Charlie Kirk suggests that most people will probably think it's more likely that they did, rather than take him for granted at his word, since his word is so devious.
Ambassador, the Donald Trump's visit to the United Kingdom and meeting he had with King Charles, it seems that the mindset in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom, is the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine. They're still pushing for that. And here is what King Charles said.
Countries have the closest defence, security, and intelligence relationship ever known. In 2 world wars, we fought together to defeat the forces of tyranny. Today, as tyranny once again threatens Europe, we and our allies stand together in support of Ukraine to deter aggression and secure peace.
Yeah. And
Well, the king reads out the statements that the government gives him to read. So that's Keir Starmer and the Labour Party speaking. And anyway, I think it has always been the case, apparently, for a very long time, certainly since the mid-19th century, that Britain is anti-Russian, very strongly anti-Russian. And that's why the Crimean War began. They were trying to cut the Russians out of any role in the Black Sea and take Sevastopol and so forth. Anyway, there's a long British tradition of being anti-Russian. It was intensified by the Cold War, when there was a good reason to be anti-Russian. And it carries on. But as you know, I've taken to calling the Europeans the coalition of the deluded, because they're completely unrealistic. They don't have the wherewithal, either financial or military, to enable Ukraine to do anything but continue to lose this war, which it's doing. And you can talk all you want about, how much we're with Ukraine, but the facts are that lots of people aren't with Ukraine, including Donald Trump. And so this is all lofty talk with very little significance in my mind. And in the case of the UK, Britain, there's something a little bit desperate about this. They went ahead with Brexit, which divorced them from the Europeans. They thought they were going to get a strengthened alliance and dependence on the United States. That hasn't happened. They're a bit adrift. They're clutching to the United States rather than drowning. That's not unintelligent. But they don't have many options. There was a moment after Brexit that began to be talked about seriously, that they thought seriously about forging a new relationship with their former colony, India. They even considered doing that with Brazil. That is because in the end, UK, although it was enormously powerful historically on 2 occasions, is much diminished. It doesn't have the population or the size of either India or Brazil, certainly not China. And those efforts failed, leaving the British with no alternative but to extol the virtues of their ongoing dependence on the United States. So that's what you just heard. It's not a great moment to be British.
just to wrap up this session, Ambassador, looking at Europe today, do you feel that they want to escalate the situation? Because after all, he mentioned World War II, and in those days, British Army was much more powerful than today. And when they're talking about fighting Russia, they basically are talking about the United States fighting Russia, not these European.
Which Americans are not inclined to do, and that is very clear that they're not inclined to do it. And in fact, Donald Trump's opposition to that was one of the things that made him acceptable as president, by contrast with Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris. So that's a forlorn hope. You mentioned World War II and the British role. Let's not forget that the British and French foolishly guaranteed the independence of Poland. That's what started the war, when the Germans and the Soviet Union divided Poland between them, and then the Germans invaded. So that kicked off a war that the British were unable to manage on their own. Churchill was desperate to bring the United States into the war because Britain couldn't win it on its own. The French surrendered. The Italians were on the wrong side. The Germans exhausted themselves, fortunately, fighting the Soviet Union. But it took the arrival of fresh troops from the United States to turn the tide in the West. The Soviet Union eventually beat the Germans in the East. But to draw those analogies is very false. Ukraine is not Poland. Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union. It's certainly not Germany. And Europeans just don't have the wherewithal to accomplish the things that they want to accomplish. So they hope the United States will do it for them. But the United States is not going to do that. Absolutely not. So I think this is all wishful thinking and political rhetoric, and aimed at some in the United States who do share the European desire to engage in bashing Russia and weakening it and isolating it. But we've tried that for 3 years and it hasn't worked. And there's no prospect that it will work.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Well, thank you for what you do, Nima. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.